This is the Smolny Institute, one of the oldest and most historically significant buildings in the Russian city of St. Petersburg. Though grand in its appearance, the building has a dark past, and was once a location of a murder that triggered one of the 20th century's most fatal domino effects. History is filled with examples of assassinations acting as a flashpoint that changed the course of fate, with perhaps the most famous example of that being that of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. However, the deadly fallout that resulted from the assassination of Soviet politician Sergei Kirov in this very building in 1934 triggered similar devastation in its consequences. Taking place amidst an increasingly suffocating political climate of paranoia and self-preservation, the murder triggered Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin's escalation from iron-fisted ruler to architect of totalitarian state terror. Not only would this assassination see the Soviet Union evolve into one of the most repressive and fear-ridden places in history during the second half of the 1930s, but it would also chip away at the nation's civilian morale and military competency to the point where any potential invasion of the country would be exacerbated from a disaster to a catastrophe. Today, we cover the story of the murder of Sergei Kirov, one of the most deadly and calamitous assassinations in all of history. From the early 20th century right up to the start of the Second World War, the land that was once the Russian Empire underwent some of the most radical social and political change the world has ever seen. In Russia's transformation from imperial power to founder of the socialist world, a young man named Sergei Kirov took his place at the heart of the revolution. A radical from a young age, the teenage Kirov was a participant in the attempt to overthrow the last monarch of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, in 1905. Arrested for his troubles, he joined the revolutionary Bolshevik movement shortly afterwards. When the Tsar was eventually overthrown in 1917 and the Bolsheviks found themselves in a bloody civil war to try and gain control of the former empire, Sergei Kirov began his gradual rise to prominence. With the Bolsheviks attempting to implement the communist ideology of the party's leader, Vladimir Lenin, Kirov was put in charge of the party's military administration in the southern Russian city of Astrakhan. As the Bolsheviks neared an eventual victory in the war, Kirov was elected a candidate member of the party Central Committee for the first time. He also became the first secretary of the Azerbaijan Party organization in 1921. He efficiently played his part in the Sovietization of the furthest reaches of the former empire, and whilst in the Caucasus, he helped to organize the founding of the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. This was later incorporated into the Soviet Union upon its founding in 1922. As Kirov began to rise through the ranks, he became a loyal ally and supporter of future leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. Kirov's initial support of Stalin is often highlighted in the context of the power struggle that followed Lenin's death in 1924. A battle where Stalin was ultimately victorious over several other of the old Bolsheviks, but their alliance had actually dated back as far as 1918, when Stalin had written in a letter that Kirov was deserving of full trust. Stalin had apparently even given Kirov a signed copy of a book that he had written on Lenin, just a few months after the leader's death, underlining their close friendship. In 1926, Kirov's loyalty was rewarded when Stalin gave him control of the Communist Party organization in St. Petersburg, or as it was now known, Leningrad. The Leningrad organization was second only to Moscow as the most important one in the country, and all of a sudden, Kirov found himself at the very heart of the Soviet leadership. As head of the Leningrad Party, Kirov quickly proved his usefulness to Stalin by weakening the opposition that was stirring in the city, headed by one of Stalin's main rivals, Grigory Zinoviev. Kirov soon became a candidate member for the Politburo, which was the executive committee of the ruling Communist Party, in 1927. And by this point, it was becoming clear that he was someone upon whom Stalin could rely. When Stalin turned against his former allies on the right wing of the party in the late 1920s, Kirov followed. Although he was still very much a strong supporter of Stalin going into the 1930s, history abounds with rumours of disagreements and tensions between the two politicians developing in this period, particularly from 1932 onwards. As history often tells us, things didn't go very well for those who ended up on Stalin's bad side. The extent to which the pair became rivals, or if they even did in the first place, is still disputed by historians. However, one thing we do know is that for the unfortunate Sergei Kirov, this phase of alleged differences with Stalin would not last very long before the ambitious revolutionary met his end. By the year 1934, Sergei Kirov was at the peak of his popularity and influence. At the 17th Bolshevik Party Congress that February, Kirov was elected to the Central Committee for the 6th time. He also remained in charge of the highly influential Leningrad Party organization, despite the fact that Stalin had wanted him to move to Moscow permanently that year. 1934 looked like it would shape up to be another successful year in the political career of the ambitious Kirov. But as fate would have it would be a year that he would not see the end of. On the afternoon of Saturday, December the 1st, he was in his office at the historic Smolny Institute in central Leningrad. In a long corridor on the building's 3rd floor, he passed a man named Leonid Nikolaev, who promptly started following him. Strangely, Kirov's main bodyguard, a man named Mikhail Borisov, was not present at this moment, with differing sources claiming that he was either 50 steps or more behind Kirov, or in a different part of the building altogether. Either way, Kirov was completely unguarded in the corridor, and Nikolaev saw his opportunity. In his own words, this is what happened next. While walking behind Kirov at a distance of 10 to 15 paces, I noted that there was nobody in the corridor for quite a distance. Then I went after him, gradually caught up with him. When Kirov turned left towards his room, the situation of which was well known to me, the whole corridor was empty. I ran 5 steps up to him, took out my revolver, and shot him in the back of the head. Instantaneously, Kirov fell on his face. With Kirov mortally wounded, the assassin turned the pistol on himself and attempted to commit suicide, but failed and instead lost consciousness, as he was carried away by law enforcement. The question on everyone's mind was, who was this individual, who in the blink of an eye had murdered one of the Soviet Union's most prominent politicians? Leonid Nikolaev was a 30-year-old man who was formerly a member of the Communist Party, but had been expelled after repeatedly clashing with other members. From March 1934 onwards he was also unemployed, and with his anger and bitterness being directed at the Soviet government, he was seemingly biding his time and waiting for the right opportunity to take his revenge. Statements from his wife and writings found in his personal diary confirmed Nikolaev's anti-Soviet feelings, and he was even alleged to have written a letter to the Politburo in 1934, listing various grudges and saying, "We, the working people, do not have any freedom in life, work, and academics." Astonishingly, this was not even the first time that Nikolaev had made an assassination attempt on Kirov, having tried on another occasion just a few weeks prior. He'd reportedly surveyed the house where Kirov lived in Leningrad, but instead tried to carry out his first attempt in the same place where he would later prove successful, the Smolny Institute. When he made his first assassination attempt on October the 15th, he was arrested by the NKVD, that's the Soviet Union's secret police organisation at the time, and was found to be carrying a handgun. But strangely, the NKVD let him go, supposedly after he showed them his party card and a weapon permit. It was just 7 weeks after being let go that Nikolaev shot Kirov dead, and soon after he regained consciousness following the chaos at Smolny, the interrogations began. Nikolaev always insisted throughout the investigation that he had acted alone in the murder, and on December the 29th, he was executed for his crime. But the long arm of the NKVD didn't stop there, with several of Nikolaev's family members and close associates also meeting the same fate in the immediate aftermath. Sergei Kirov was gone, and his assassin punished. But the debate and mystery regarding the true forces behind Kirov's death was only just beginning. Despite Leonid Nikolaev's assertion that he acted alone, the circumstances surrounding Kirov's death have perplexed historians for decades, with several theories suggesting the involvement of Stalin himself. Let's take a look at some of the peculiarities surrounding the assassination. As we've already mentioned, the NKVD security forces let Nikolaev walk free and retain his weapon after his initial arrest at the Smolny Institute on October 15th. You would think that such an incident would act as a wake-up call and lead to a tightening of the security apparatus that was designed to protect Kirov, but remarkably the exact opposite happened, and his security personnel were reduced in the following weeks. And then what of the security guards themselves? As highlighted, Mikhail Borisov was one of those most directly responsible for Kirov's safety, but at the moment of the assassination, Borisov was nowhere near him, a blatant failing of his duties. Borisov was arrested for his negligence, and just 1 day after the Kirov shooting, he was killed in an apparent car accident whilst being transported by the NKVD. Nobody else died in this accident, and statements that were later made by some of those close to both Kirov and Borisov suggest that the latter's death was not an accident. Other members of the Leningrad NKVD also came under scrutiny, with much of the blame for the assassination being pinned on the agency's incompetence. The leader of the NKVD, Henryk Yagoda, wrote a letter where he said that some of the Leningrad agents had become blind and deaf and in fact were asleep at their revolutionary post. The failure by the NKVD to prevent the murder was certainly unusual, and Soviet author Alexander Barmin claimed that the negligence of the NKVD in protecting such a high party official was without precedent in the Soviet Union. 2 days after the Kirov assassination, Yagoda ordered for 8 officers in the Leningrad NKVD to be fired and arrested, with some of them sentenced to up to 10 years in prison. However, these officers did not actually serve these sentences, and instead were simply demoted to less prestigious roles in state security. It is also notable that Yagoda himself, who bore the ultimate responsibility for Kirov's death, went unpunished. But perhaps the biggest piece of the puzzle, and the part of this story that has interested historians for the last 90 years, is Joseph Stalin. How did he react in the weeks and months following Kirov's assassination? Stalin was initially informed of the shooting by telephone, within an hour of it taking place. The dictator was in a meeting at the time with some of his ministers, and when told the news, simply said the word idiots, perhaps referring to the Leningrad NKVD. Sources from the time claim that Stalin himself was closely involved with the investigation of the murder, and that he even interrogated Nikolaev personally. Right from the start, Stalin used the investigation as an opportunity to accuse and intimidate groups in the Soviet Union who were opposed to his rule. This primarily meant those on the left wing of the party, such as those who were followers of Grigory Zinoviev and Leon Trotsky. Stalin instructed Yagoda's deputy, the brutal Nikolai Yezhov, to look for murderers among the Zinovievites. Nikolaev did have some links with the Trotskyites, but always categorically denied the involvement of both the Trotskyites and the Zinovievites in the murder. But for Stalin, this was the perfect opportunity to frame these groups as being a terrorist threat to the Soviet Union. The murder of Kirov acted as the trigger for Stalin to increase repression and control. The accusations that were levelled at both the Trotskyites and Zinovievites were the first steps in Stalin's road to the Great Purge. But could Stalin really have been the man behind Kirov's death? Stalin had served as a mentoring figure to Kirov for over a decade, and as mentioned, the two had been quite close. The narrative of a rivalry developing may be a bit exaggerated, but it is true that Kirov didn't always toe the line of what Stalin wanted. Some historians allege that in 1932, Kirov talked Stalin out of executing Martemian Ryutin, a man who had formed a group that heavily attacked Stalin's leadership and tried to encourage his removal. There were also rumours that Stalin received a large number of negative votes at the 17th Bolshevik Party Congress in early 1934, with the delegates voting a lot more favourably for Kirov. Stalin supposedly had these ballots destroyed. These tellings of both of these events are heavily disputed by historians. But what we do know is that by 1934, Kirov was a popular figure within the Soviet leadership, and given Stalin's track record in later years of demoting or executing those that he perceived as rivals, it's not too far-fetched to think that Stalin came to see Kirov as a threat to his control over the party. One of the main proponents of the story that Stalin had Kirov assassinated was Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's eventual successor as leader of the Soviet Union who came to power in the 1950s. Khrushchev claimed that Stalin had organised the murder of the NKVD, and similar narratives build on this to suggest that after being given this task, Yagoda delegated it to his subordinates, who then selected Nikolaev, an angry and unstable individual, as being the perfect candidate for the job. Khrushchev also claimed that the NKVD guards who had avoided the harsh punishments in 1934 were later executed in 1937 to tie up some of the remaining loose ends in the case. This particular version of the assassination was pushed during Khrushchev's initiative of de-Stalinization in the 1950s, so perhaps it isn't surprising that he was trying to implicate his predecessor in the murder. De-Stalinization was an opportunity for politicians like Khrushchev to absolve themselves of blame for the bloodshed that took place in the second half of the 1930s, so both his motives and the credibility of his claims are questionable. Even beyond the Khrushchev years, the assassination was reviewed time and time again through the decades, both in the Soviet era and beyond. But despite all the contemporary rumours, historical arguments, and evidence, all investigations have struggled to find archive material that directly supports the participation of either Stalin or the NKVD in Kirov's assassination. The question of culpability in Kirov's murder will probably carry on forever, with so many potential theories involved. Whether or not Stalin was behind the assassination, what happened in the following years was perhaps best summarized by Soviet author Boris Nikolaevsky, who said, One thing is certain, the only man who profited by the Kirov assassination was Stalin, for the worst of the bloodshed was still to come. The assassination of Sergei Kirov was the flashpoint from which Stalin launched the infamous Great Purge. Stalin using Kirov's death to turn the party against both Trotsky and Zinoviev was just the beginning. The discovery of the Kremlin plot in 1935, in which Kremlin staff were supposedly planning to assassinate Stalin, only intensified the atmosphere of suspicion and distrust, and led to further condemnation of Trotsky and Zinoviev, as well as another old Bolshevik named Lev Kamenev. These three formed the main opposition to Stalin's increasingly authoritarian rule in the 1930s, and Stalin used the Kirov assassination as a pretext to arrest them. Zinoviev and Kamenev were first sentenced and then executed at the trial of 16 in August 1936, one of the first major events of the Purge. Trotsky had been living outside of the Soviet Union for several years by that point, and was sentenced to death in absentia. This emboldened Stalin's attempts to rid the Communist Party of any opposition to his rule, and other old Bolsheviks like Nikolai Bukharin and Alexei Rykov, who led the right wing of the party, eventually met the same fate as both Kamenev and Zinoviev. Terms such as counter-revolutionaries, which were thrown at opposition targets during the Kirov investigation, were escalated to the likes of Fifth Column, saboteurs, and most infamously, enemies of the people. Through both the ruthlessness of the executions and brutality of the Gulag labour camps, the Purge targeted not only top politicians, but also political officers, intellectuals, ethnic minorities, and just about every societal group that you could possibly think of. The morale of Soviet society had been broken and consumed with the dark cloud of fear. But perhaps the most famous purge of all fell on the military. As the Red Army was created by Trotsky, it's perhaps no surprise that Stalin treated it with paranoia and suspicion. The Red Army was purged at all levels, from the execution of military strategist Mikhail Tukhachevsky to the removal of countless officers and soldiers. Although a lot of the officers removed were returned to their posts after the purge ended in 1938, the damage done by Stalin to the top ranks of the army was calamitous. An army now facing severe gaps in military leadership, strategy, and innovation was stretched even further by a huge expansion that took place between 1938 and 1941. All of this contributed to the human catastrophe that fell on the Red Army and the Soviet people when Nazi Germany invaded. The purges did help to accelerate the careers of some of the Soviet Union's greatest war heroes, such as Georgy Zhukov, but at the start of the war, the lack of experience in the upper rungs of the Red Army were woefully exposed. The Soviet death toll was in the millions, and one wonders how much of this damage could have been prevented had the Soviet military not been so brutally purged just 3 years earlier. Throughout history, we often see that the biggest turning points are influenced by a number of factors, even if they are triggered by a sudden moment. In this respect, Kirov's death alone cannot be used to explain all of the death and destruction that followed, but by triggering the bloodthirsty purge of a paranoid leader, we can see how this assassination withered the morale and stoked the fear of the people of the Soviet Union. The damage inflicted led to a weakened population suffering terribly during a war that a decimated army was simply not prepared for. We'll probably never know for certain if it was just a single disgruntled individual behind the assassination of Sergei Kirov, or if it was the work of Stalin himself. But perhaps the focus of Kirov's assassination should not be on those responsible, but the legacy that it left. For one thing we do know, is that the death of the dictator's old friend triggered repression and brutality like the world had never seen. It was a ticket to terror and totalitarianism that would be unrelenting until Stalin's death almost 2 decades later. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.